Hi, good afternoon. Story time at Umlauf Families and Friends. It's Frances once again. And hello, Frances here once again with Story Time from my home, but on behalf of the Umlauf Sculpture Garden and Museum, where I am a docent and I coordinate the tours for the public, lots of tours for school children. And each week I have been sharing a story book just like this for, I guess, the last couple months or so that we all can gather together and think about connections that we can make with, hello again, with words and with images that we may have in our head from being in the garden. And this book is pertinent because it reminds me not necessarily of our sculpture garden, because this garden is a backyard garden. And we have a sculpture garden at the Umlauf. There is a treasure here in this book that made me think of our sculptures. In a way, we can find treasures when we search within the Umlauf. We can find visual treasures that we don't necessarily have to unearth by digging in a garden like our storybook will show us, but we can visually search for treasures in that we have Charles Umlauf's beautiful works scattered throughout our garden paths. Let's get started. I also actually want to mention that I found this book when I read recently a feature article in the Statesman in our newspaper here in Austin, and it was by a wonderful writer named Nicole Villalpando, and she does a wonderful feature often called Raising Austin, and y'all can find her on social media under Raising Austin. And she helped me find this book because she published a feature on books, recently published books that have shared with readers character diversity, and in just a little bit more detail where to find this listing of books that celebrate diverse characters, especially important. I may be having a little bit of trouble connecting. I'm going to open our door just to make sure. I'm back. I'm thinking maybe I have solved the problem. This book is called Khalil and Mr Hagerty and the Backyard Treasures. The other thing about this book that I enjoy is that it celebrates diversity of ages. This is a book about a young boy and an older gentleman who happen to be neighbors, and the discoveries they make together and the help that they can provide each other as newly formed friends. Khalil's new house had an up and a down. There's Khalil in his window. That's his new house. Upstairs lived his family, which was big and busy and noisy. Downstairs lived Mr. Hagerty, who was quiet. I have to always orient it. Do you see the family? There's Khalil and his family. He's got a couple baby siblings, and there's Mr. Hagerty downstairs. Khalil loved the backyard. So did Mr. Hagerty. They shared a backyard. While Mr. Hagerty worked in his garden, Khalil hunted for bugs and interesting rocks. We've talked about rocks before in story time. So there's Mr. Hagerty in his garden. You can see he's got a white beard. He's got a basket or a bowl full of vegetables. And here is Khalil hunting for rocks, and looks like he's spying some ladybugs. Khalil lay in the grass and read his library books. Sometimes, if he couldn't figure out a word, he asked for help. Mr. Hagerty would squint through his glasses. And this is when Khalil would ask Mr. Hagerty, "How do you say tarantula?" Mr. Hagerty would say quietly. Or volcano, or doubloons. So it sounds like Khalil likes to read a lot. Sometimes Mr. Hagerty needed help with his words too. Where did I put my digging thing, my hole maker, my shovel, says Khalil. It's pretty cute. I can't find, what is it that I'm looking for? I'm looking for a shovel. And then Mr. Hagerty says, look at this big, not beeper, not beastie beetle, says Khalil. So he's helping him remember words. Sometimes people of all ages can't remember words. That summer, the house was hot. Upstairs and downstairs, it was much too hot. Even in the backyard, the sun burned and the air sizzled. One morning when Khalil went out, everything looked droopy. Even Mr. Hagerty. Khalil decided this would be a good day to find buried treasure. So there's Mr. Hagerty. He's having a little bit of a lower energy day. He's out there in his garden with his shovel. Here's Khalil. He's also digging with a small trowel, looks like. They both look like they're having a little bit of a droopy day. The ground was hard to dig. Khalil found a few things, but not what anyone would call treasure. Mr. Hagerty dug too. He found some carrots, but they were small and shriveled. The word for this was discouraging. The word was discouraging. So it looks like they're both learning some new words. Small, nothing, really special treasures. It looks very small, shriveled carrots. We need refreshments, said Mr. Hagerty. Refreshments turned out to mean big pieces of chocolate cake and tall, cold glasses of milk. I wonder if young people use the word refreshments. I kind of knew what that meant. But then again, I'm not as young as some of my viewers. Soon, Khalil and Mr. Hagerty both felt much better. Maybe we'll be luckier tomorrow, said Khalil. Maybe, said Mr. Hagerty. I want you to notice, we're watching them, we're looking at them having their refreshments. I like the artwork on the wall behind at Mr. Hagerty's kitchen table. I want us to also look carefully at the kitchen area where there are shelves. Look at the cool things that Mr. Hagerty has on his shelf. This book also spoke to me because of the cool things, like there's a sculpture up there on the top shelf, and look closely at these two small items on the second shelf between the pickle jar and whatever else that jar is with the little green circles in it. See those two items? Don't forget you saw that. Upstairs that night, Khalil had an idea. Downstairs, so did Mr. Hagerty. So here's Khalil. He's at his kitchen table eating. And take a note, he's eating some carrots, looks like. And over here, Mr. Hagerty is spying on his shelf that we just discussed. And he's having an idea too. So it looks like Khalil and Mr. Hagerty are both thinking. And here's a picture of them going out into the garden. Mr. Hagerty going out into the garden with his flashlight, and then Khalil going out into the garden on Mr. Hagerty's side with his trowel. First thing in the morning, Khalil raced down into the yard. Mr. Hagerty was already there. He looked excited as Khalil. You better get digging, he said in his voice. And his voice was not the least bit quiet anymore. You too, said Khalil. This was when something wonderful happened. Two somethings. So there's Mr. Hagerty talking to Khalil. And they're both saying, hey, something's going on out in the garden. You better go check it out. No sooner did Mr. Hagerty put his shovel in the dirt, and he dug out a big, juicy carrot. Wonder what that came from. And you can see Khalil's kind of spying on him. Remember, Khalil had carrots for dinner. That would have been wonderful enough, but then Khalil found buried treasure. This calls for refreshments, Khalil said. Mr. Hagerty is smiling because look what Khalil has found. Do you remember those two little treasures? They celebrated with carrot sticks and chocolate cake. It's our lucky day, said Khalil. Lucky's the word, said Mr. Hagerty. There's the shelf with two pieces missing. Mr. Hagerty and Khalil having a high five with carrots and chocolate cake. And look what's right by Khalil. Those two little treasures. That night, as Khalil looked out his window upstairs, he thought of another word, a very good word, one of the best words of all. Downstairs, so did Mr. Hagerty. Friend was the word. Upstairs and downstairs friends. And then this page. I like this book because it shares with us friendship between different aged people, friendship between people who did not know they had something in common until they took the time to discover it. So again, I wanted to thank Nicole Villalpando. She is a writer for the Austin American-Statesman, and she and I have been communicating about books that have caught her eye, and then I wanted to try, and so she offered to loan me a copy of her book. So thank you, Nicole. Thank you for keeping up with these new titles that are coming out that celebrate character diversity. And again, it's in the Statesman. There's going to be a link on this post that will give you those titles, and I will be back next week with another one of those titles, thinking about one that has to do with camping. Because it is summer, and maybe you're camping out in the backyard, maybe you're camping at a state park, maybe you're going a little farther and camping and visiting relatives if you can. But I wanted to wish you all a happy summer, and if you are not able to come into our garden yet, we do hope you come. We are open, and we are taking every precaution possible to keep the garden as fun and as safe for everyone. We are outdoors, so there's a lot of room. I did a story time this week with some live children, and we all sat on individual blankets, or the groups of kids sat on blankets, and I wore a mask, and they still heard me. I also wanted to share with you that our Shaping Space program, Living Color, is available online. You can go to the Umlauf Sculpture Garden and Museum website and find activities that have to do with our June theme of living color. And then in July, we'll have another set of materials for you to explore virtually. Again, thanks so much for joining me. Have a wonderful weekend.